Arjun Erigaisi kicks off this titled Tuesday Grand Prix match against Nitish Belurkar with pawn to d4. Knight f6, pawn c4, pawn to e6. We are looking at an Indian defense setup. For white's next move, they typically go knight to c3 to challenge the center, or knight to f3 to stop the Nimzo Indian from happening. Knight to f3. Arjun opts to avoid the Nimzo. Black has a few ways to respond here. Pushing the pawn to d5 takes space and transitions into a Queen's Gambit decline style structure. Or, pushing to b6 heads straight into a Queen's Indian defense. Pawn to d5. Nitish goes for the solid central approach. White has a few popular replies in this position. The main line is usually knight to c3, or maybe putting pressure on the knight with bishop to g5. Arjun goes for pawn to e3, very solid, defending the pawn on d4, but it does lock in his own dark squared bishop. From here, black can challenge the center immediately with pawn to c5, or just develop quietly with bishop to e7. Pawn to c5, Nitish wastes no time striking back at the center. White can keep the tension or resolve it right now by trading pawns with c takes on d5. C takes on d5. Arjun decides to trade. Black can recapture with the e-pawn to maintain a really strong central presence, or take with the knight. Knight takes on d5. By taking with the knight, black avoids an isolated queen's pawn, but it does allow white to kick that knight away. White's most natural next move here is pushing the pawn to e4. Pawn to e4, exactly! Arjun gains space with tempo and attacks the knight. Now black has to move it again. Dropping back to f6 is by far the most common retreat. Knight back to f6, keeping an eye on that e4 pawn. Knight c3. Black captures the pawn in the center, immediately threatening to capture the knight on c3. The queen recaptures on d4, stepping right into the middle of the board and casually preventing the capture on c3. Next, black brings out the light squared bishop. Now pawn to e5. I love this. We are transitioning right into a sharp middle game. White is instantly grabbing space and suffocating the opponent's position, threatening to just take the knight on f6. This is exactly how you dictate the terms of a chess game. Knight to c6 comes out, attacking the centralized queen. This prevents the pawn from taking on f6 and creates a direct threat against the queen. Casually, the queen slides over to f4, eyeing the king side and safely moving away from the knight's attack. Jumping the knight to d5 hits the queen again. Black is just trying to gain time, threatening to capture her on f4. Trading off on d5 immediately, completely stopping that threat against the queen. Pawn takes back, and suddenly black's central structure is totally locked up. Bishop to d2, calmly preparing the rest of the army. A full 65 seconds to play bishop to c5? Bro, this is a 5-minute blitz game. You cannot burn over 20% of your clock to put a piece on a totally normal square, especially when it leaves the bishop completely loose on c5. Time management is critical, people. Okay, look at this pawn skeleton right here. It literally tells the whole story of the position. Notice black's completely isolated pawn on d5, sitting right next to white's advanced pawn on e5. Because black's d-pawn has absolutely no friendly neighbors to defend it, it becomes a massive long-term target. White should just blockade this structure and pile pressure directly onto that weakness. Remember, a fractured pawn formation like this is exactly how you slowly squeeze an opponent to death. Taking aim with the bishop to d3, pointing a massive sniper rifle right at the h7 square. You can already feel the bad intentions. Castling the king to safety, or at least they think it's safe. But this kingside is going to become a major target soon. Securing the white king as well. Oh, what is this? Pawn to h6 is played. And this is a massive mistake. Instead of solidifying the structure, black creates a huge hook. When you push pawns in front of your castled king like this, you are just begging your opponent to launch an attack. At this point, I think it would have been much better to push the f-pawn to f6 to challenge the center. Rook to c1, bringing the heavy artillery to the c-file. This also creates an immediate threat to just capture that loose bishop on c5. Retreating the bishop to b6 to get out of the way of the rook's attack. Queen to g3! Look at how white is lining up the pieces. The queen and that dark squared bishop are staring intensely down the board. A storm is brewing. White is setting up a direct attack to capture on h6, aiming to completely rip open the king's defenses. Stepping into the corner to h8, trying to sidestep the pressure, preventing the immediate disaster on h6, and maybe preparing to slide the rook over to e8. Bishop to g5. What a gorgeous, annoying move. White attacks the queen and forces a reaction immediately, completely shutting down any ideas of bringing the rook to e8. 17 seconds to play queen to e8. And it loses the game on the spot! The evaluation bar just spiked into orbit. Black tries to keep the position together and save the queen, but they just walked straight into a buzzsaw. Let's look at a better variation black could have played. The pawn could take on g5, then the knight would capture right back, and the king could slide to g8. This would look much better. Okay, now let's get back to the game. Boom! Bishop to f6. White shoves the piece right down the opponent's throat. The threat is an unstoppable checkmate. Forced to capture on f6. Black spent 80 seconds staring at their own demise. Queen to h4. The major piece joins the hunt, desperately pushing the f-pawn to block, smashing into h6 with check. The king retreats. Knight to g5. Game over. What an incredibly instructive display of attacking chess. This game perfectly demonstrates why you have to be so careful about pushing pawns in front of your king. Once that weakness was created, the punishment was swift and brutal. Let me know in the comments if you would have spotted that final mating sequence, and don't forget to subscribe for more top-tier chess recaps. See you in the next one!